Welcome back to Barrytsgarage. Today we're talking about flatheads, and there's going to be more than one video on this, but we're going to speak with Steve Coppock. And Steve has some pretty good credentials for flathead work. He owns 92 flatheads. He's driven a flathead since he was 15 years old, and he is in the business of servicing or selling parts for flatheads. So Steve has a lot of experience and a lot of information, and we're going to get started learning a little more about flatheads today. I'm going to learn a lot. Hopefully I can bring you along and you can learn a lot too. So this is going to be great. Steve, welcome back. It's good to have you back on Barrytsgarage.
Hey Barry, it's good to see you again.
Yeah,
Thanks for coming by.
And you have a lot of experience and some knowledge, and no one knows everything, but you know a lot. And I'm very happy to ask you about maybe the different versions of flatheads. How would you group the different versions of the Flathead Ford V8?
Oh, that's a great question, Barry, and I don't think there's any real standard on that, but I think about them this way. I think about them in three categories.
Okay.
I like to group the earliest flatheads, so 1932 to 1937.
Yep.
Those were the 21 stud, they call them. That's how many bolts or studs hold the cylinder head on each side, 21 studs as a group. And then I like to think of 1938 to 1948, which are the 24 stud motors, but they also had the extended bell housing like the first generation motors did.
Right.
And then the third category that I think of are what I call the 8BA. That's what Ford called them, but I include the Mercuries in there too. So 49 to 53 would be the third category that I would use. I don't think I'm the only one that groups them that way, but maybe not everybody does. But
sure.
That's how I like to think about them.
Well, there's going to be a lot of people that are experts, and we're going to welcome them to add their comments. But this is, we like to say, like our mutual friend Ed Smith says, I'm not going to tell you how to do it. I'll tell you how I do it. And we're not going to tell you how to group them, but this is how we're going to group them.
Yeah, that's a great point. And there's a lot of information out there about antique vehicles, Fords, and especially the flatheads. I'm going to give my version best I can, and I'm sure there'll be others that might have some different information or might disagree or may agree. I don't know. But
sure.
To add to the community of knowledge, putting those comments in your video would be helpful to everybody.
Yeah,
but I'll give you my version, and
yeah, that's right.
We'll go from there.
Yeah, no, we do appreciate the comments. All right, well, let's start. The first year, 1932, and just the tiny bit of background I know, Henry Ford was working really hard to get a single casting of a V8 engine that could be done at scale at a good cost. Mm-hmm. And so the 1932 Ford Flathead V8 came out, right?
That's right. Yep, came out in March of 1932. And a lot of people have never seen a real 1932 Flathead Ford V8. As you said, there was the first year out. There was, at least from what I read, some urgency to get the new Model 32 Ford out on the road, but as well to introduce a mass-produced V8 engine to the general public. So while they came out in 1932, there were a lot of changes within the model year 1932, and then beyond 33 and 34 beyond, continued to change and evolve that engine. So finding a real 32 engine is pretty difficult these days. I happen to have most of one here.
Okay.
And I've pulled it out, and if you'd like to walk around it and just kind of talk about the differences.
Yeah.
And maybe we can use that as a springboard to talk about some other changes in those first generation engines.
Let's do it.
Okay.
Let's have a look here. I'm seeing this engine, and the first thing that's kind of easy for me to tell is these big spouts coming out of the water pumps up top. Tell me about this engine. What's going on here?
Yeah, Barry, thanks. And that what you just pointed out there is a uniqueness of the 32 Fords. These water pumps up on the heads like this are not unique, but the tall outlets from the water pumps are unique to 1932.
Okay.
For those that know the 33 and 34 cars, they leaned the grill shell back quite a bit. Okay. And because of that, the radiator's physically different in a 33 and 34. And as a result, the water pumps happen to be shorter. I don't know if you can pan over and look at this engine right here. But this would be examples of water pumps that were used on later engines. There are some differences. I'm just pointing out the shorter neck in this particular one.
Okay.
So that is a unique item for 1932.
Okay.
How the engine is mounted to the frame is unique for 1932 as well.
Okay. Let's have a look at that.
32 has these, I call them feet, that stick out, 2 bolts onto the block and then come out to the frame where there would be a rubber pad to mount the engine. The water inlets are here, and they bolt on separate from the motor mount itself. Now those are in pretty bad shape, but nonetheless you can see that they're 2 separate pieces, and these are unique to 1932 as well.
So only 32.
Yep.
Okay.
This coil, the distributor itself is a little bit unique as well. This really tall 3-bolt coil is unique to 1932 as well.
Okay.
And those are extremely hard to find, those tall coils like that. 1 year only.
Okay.
The cylinder heads are unique as well.
Okay.
One of the things that you can see right off the bat is how big the spark plugs are. That's a 7/8 inch diameter spark plug, and that was unique to 1932.
Wow.
33 and beyond had a much, still big, but much smaller spark plug than that. So 32 also was cast iron heads. The Ford went to aluminum heads in 33 and 34. A lot of those got replaced with cast iron later, but 32s came with cast iron cylinder heads.
Okay, and again, there's 21 studs or bolt holes on both heads.
That's right.
Head. Okay.
A quick way, if you're ever at a swap meet or in the junkyard, just to rather than counting how many there are, just there's 5 bolts along or stud holes along the bottom of the head. That's an easy way to identify any 21 stud motor. Okay. Just from those bolt holes.
I'm sure the 24 has more than that.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Cool.
Yep. Can I talk about a few other differences?
Yeah, let's find out as much as we can here.
Yeah, this intake manifold is unique to 1932 as well. The carburetor is unique. I'll talk a few more details. The generator is specific. The fuel pump specific.
Oh, wow.
So we'll start with the carburetor. This is a Detroit lubricator, is the company.
Okay.
People have probably heard of Strongberg or Holley or even Ford carburetors, but this was a company called Detroit Lubricator. It's a 1-barrel carburetor, and this one is unique to 1932. They were also used in 1933, but there was a little arm on the side over here on the driver's side where there's not on a 32, and that was for a dash-mounted throttle lever. So 32s don't have that. 33s do have that.
Okay.
Something else we mentioned it earlier is this fuel pump. 33 and beyond used a stand that included a place to put the oil in and also the breather. But in 32, they mounted the fuel pump directly to the intake manifold. And the fuel pump push rod pushed straight up on the diaphragm to operate the fuel pump. And then the oil breather tube was right here in front of the fuel pump. I don't happen to have one, but there would be a tube with a breather cap on top.
Sure.
And that would make it unique to 32 only.
Wow.
This generator is quite unique as well. Most people that are familiar with flatheads are familiar with the generator being raised up to tighten the belt. There was a slide mechanism in the front. But in 1932, the generator was actually mounted on a post.
Oh, you're kidding. Boy, I wasn't ready for that.
That was 1 year only. So the intake manifold is machined for that post, and it has a pinch bolt that once you get the adjustment where you want it, then
so you're literally pinching the cast intake manifold?
Yeah, it's cut right down the middle there, so you have a little bit of a squeeze point. That is unique to 32 as well.
And so you still have to use it for your tightening your belt.
Yeah, one piece I'm missing is there's a big nut that goes right here, and you can use the threads that are on this shaft to actually get the get the generator where you want
to
it.
kind of leverage it up.
Yep, and then you tighten the pinch bolt and tighten everything
I see.
up.
Okay.
This fan is 32 only. The breather or the air cleaner is 32 only.
I'm assuming it's an oil bath.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Another thing to note is the oil pan is aluminum on the 32 blocks.
Really?
Yep, they're all aluminum.
Wow.
The some people might say, "Hey, Steve, how do we know that that's really a 32 casting?" And the answer to that is twofold.
Okay.
Right here in front, you might be able to see it here, Barry. There's a drain for the block right here.
Yep.
And on a 32, that's straight down. It points straight at the ground. Later years, 33 and on, it's angled out just a little bit.
Okay.
And also, up here in the front of the block,
okay,
between the timing cover and the motor mount, that surface right there where my finger is smooth.
Okay.
And all other years, 33 and later, there's a cavity there.
Okay.
And if you want to come back and look at this one again,
yeah,
it looks like that cavity right next to the motor mount.
Oh, sure. Right.
Yep. 32 is the only one that doesn't have that. And that's
Interesting.
2 ways, the straight down water petcock, they call it,
Uh-huh.
and no cavity there. Those are unique to 1932 only.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I think that's the majority of the 32 specific things.
Okay, well, we've covered a lot, so there's a lot of things specific to 32.
Yeah.
As a starter and that part of it very much similar?
They're very similar. I'm not sure that I'm smart enough to know the difference between the 32 starter, but I don't think there's uniqueness to the 32 starter. There could be, and somebody could certainly chime in and let us know about that.
Okay, Steve, tell me about this exhaust manifold on the 32.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. This is another uniqueness of 32, at least on the driver's side, is that the manifold is basically just straight, both on the outside and the inside. The dipstick tube is right here. It's part of the oil pan, but the dipstick comes out below the exhaust manifold.
Okay. So it's going to curl its way around that on the outside of it.
Yeah.
Okay, and for what years did that happen?
Well, 32 was the only year that had the dipstick that came out underneath of the exhaust manifold.
Okay.
If you can come over here, this is either a 33 or 34.
Okay.
And you can see how this manifold is curved right here.
Sure is.
And on this one, the dipstick tube would come up through here, and the dipstick would come right down through there.
Okay.
So the driver's side manifold on the 32 is unique in that it's flat across both the front and the back. I would say folks that are restoring an original 1932 car would be the candidates for needing this particular motor. A lot of people, of course, modify 1932s, put all kinds of different, engine and transmissions in them, and they would not be interested in this motor at all. If somebody wanted to just put a flathead in general in their 32 Ford, there's plenty of other choices, but the purists that really are trying to restore an authentic 1932 Ford car would want to use this particular motor. You really have to want to use one,
right? Because
they're difficult to find, and all these accessories that are on here that we talked about are hard to find.
Now, what was the rated horsepower when this?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, they were a powerhouse. 65 horsepower in 1932 when they came out.
Okay.
Interestingly, the 4-cylinder that was available in 1932 was rated at 50 horsepower. So you got twice the cylinders, but only 15 more horsepower.
Okay.
In 1932. 33, they went up about 10 horsepower. There's some differences in the head, and if we have time, we'll talk about that.
Okay.
And a little bit of difference in the cam timing. So the heads increased the compression a little bit.
Okay.
And raised it 10 horsepower, and then again in 1934, another 10 horsepower. So by 1934 and really up to the rest of the Generation 1 flatheads, 21 studs, 85 horsepower was the norm, if you will.
Okay.
This motor would not be something I'd recommend personally to be upgraded much, if any. There's a lot of car clubs, and there are actually some vintage drag racing organizations
Mm-hmm.
that really like the 21 stud motor.
Mm-hmm.
But I would recommend some of the later ones,
Okay.
like 35, 36, 36 especially, and we can talk about why in
Yeah.
a little bit.
Okay.
But this is such a unique piece.
Yeah.
I think keeping it stock and restored would be the best.
Its best
use
feature is that it's the original
Yeah,
concept.
yeah.
Okay.
And like I said, there's a lot that is similar to later engines, but there's a lot of uniqueness to the 32, which makes it, I think, a candidate for
Yeah.
restoration. We talked about the uniqueness of the cylinder head on the engine. This is a 32 cylinder head also. It just happens to be off the engine.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't happen to be in very good shape, but it serves the purpose of talking about
Yeah.
some of the differences. We talked about these large spark plug holes earlier, and that's 32 only, but this heart-shaped combustion chamber is also unique to 1932.
Really? Okay.
You can tell by looking at it that it's a big chamber, and so it has relatively low compression.
Mm-hmm.
It is, as we mentioned earlier, cast iron, not aluminum. But this is an example of what the 32 head looks like. So again, if you're in the swap meet or kicking around old flathead parts and you find this heart-shaped combustion chamber, you know it's a 1932 and 32 only.
Okay. Now we're seeing an aluminum head right next to it.
Yeah, I brought this out, and this is an example of what was available in 32. I'm sorry, 33, 34, 35, and 36. Really, they're made out of aluminum.
Okay.
Instead of cast iron, but a lot of these were replaced by customers and maintenance folks with cast iron versions that Ford did offer over the counter because they were very difficult to get off of the block. We talked about the studs coming up through to hold the cylinder heads on. They're made of steel. This is made aluminum, and so they corroded between the two and made these heads almost impossible to get off at times.
Wow.
So this happens to be a brand new one though, which are kind of difficult to find. But,
so this is like an OEM.
Yep. So
new
old stock.
New
Ford.
old stock.
Yep.
Wow.
So since the water pumps, this would be an example of the right-hand side head. This would not work on the left-hand side.
Right.
So they were different left to right.
And
the little R right there at the end would show you that it is an R for right-hand side.
And we just saw that it says 1934 on the end there. So newer design.
Yeah. So this is an example of what Ford went with after 32.
Okay.
And you can, I think, visually just tell that this chamber is slightly smaller, overall than this one.
Yep. And you can easily see the difference in size for the spark plug holes here too.
Yeah.
Excellent.
So there's the cylinder heads.
Okay. What else do we have here as far as, what's this cam from?
I wanted to show an example. This is not necessarily a 1932 cam, but it's representative of what would be in the 32 motor.
Okay.
I guess what I wanted to show was that the timing gears didn't bolt on in the early days. They were actually pressed on to the end of the camshaft. There's a mark on the cam and mark on the cam, mark on the gear. You line them up and you press them together.
Really?
And of course, this is made out of primarily fiber. And it's my understanding that that's both to keep it quiet and probably was a little less expensive, maybe, I don't know, than the aluminum version.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, the aluminum version, you can see the bolt holes you bolted on.
Yeah, so that would be for a later model flathead, and we can talk about that later today or another time.
Okay, all right. And you also have some 32 pistons here. I mean, piston rods, connecting rods.
What I have is just an example of, a lot of people don't seem to know too much about the connecting rods, but they're very unique. Ford used, these were called full floating rod bearings.
Okay.
And by full floating, it means they not only spin or rotate on the crankshaft, but they also rotate inside of the connecting rod.
So it's okay to spin the bearings.
It's okay. So I just sort of put this together to show they have flanges. The early ones had flanges on each end, like this one does.
Oh yeah.
And then the rods just spin on the bearings. And then of course the crankshaft would be in here. So that's kind of that's a unique thing. They're 2-inch nominally diameter on the crank.
Uh-huh.
And that's an example of the early, not just 32, but the
first series.
Early, first generation.
Okay.
Something else I guess I wanted to point out, and this is not unique to 32, but definitely the first generations, and this is kind of a crusty looking rear main bearing cap, but they were not machined for rear crank seal.
Really?
So there was no rear main seal in the back of the motors of these. They
Wow.
used a slinger on the crank, so the crank had a slinger built into it. Slinger just like a round ring. There's actually two of them, one that fit in this groove and one that fit in this groove.
Uh-huh.
And so as oil came in contact with it, if the engine was running, it would, through centrifugal force, move the oil out towards the edges. It would collect in this in these troughs and then drain right back into the oil pan through this tube.
Really?
Of course, if the motor's not running and oil seeps back there, it just naturally drains down into that same.
That's actually a pretty good solution, isn't
it?
Well,
they used that for many years, and you know, they do leak a little bit, but not as much as you'd think with no rear main seal.
Right? That's good.
Barry, I brought these out today just to show you. We talked about the uniqueness of the 32 manifold.
Right.
This is still a Detroit lubricator carburetor, but it does have that arm on the driver's side that I mentioned.
And have a look.
So if you remember on the 32, there was no arm here.
No,
so this is an example for 33.
Uh-huh.
You can see where the oil fill and crank vent on the other motor was. It's blocked off on this one.
Huh.
And so it would use a fuel pump stand similar to this.
Okay.
This happens to be an example of a 34 and later. And it's important because it went to a Stromberg 3-bolt carburetor.
Uh-huh.
You can see both on the 33 and the 34 that there's the
mount
more typical generator mount and an adjustment mechanism, where the 32 was that post.
Yep.
So this was the beginning of this was in 1934 and through 38, and that used the Stromberg carburetor on the Ford, which was a 2-barrel carburetor compared to the single-barrel Detroit lubricator.
Wow, very good. Yeah, thank you for showing us these differences.
Yeah, sure.
So this is a fuel pump and the breather. So the breather would breathe down past the.
This would let air in and out of the engine. There wasn't a what you might consider a crankcase vent. This is a crankcase vent, but until 1935. So still in the first generation, but in 1935, all the way through 1953, there was a crankcase vent system that Ford engineered in. It still had a breather up top and a place where you could put the oil in, but it actually had a vent down lower on the engine. In first and second generation Flatheads, it vented out the out an opening in the oil pan, and then 49 to 53, it vented out through the intake manifold.
Yeah. So this just comes off for oil filling? You just remove that? Okay.
It's an interesting thing. It looks kind of, I don't know, innocuous. It just sets up on top like that. But I tell you, you change that out on an engine with no rear main seal, and all of a sudden it'll start pressurizing the crankcase and push oil right out. So don't be messing with these early vent systems.
Right. Yeah. It's not a mix and match situation, is it?
It's designed for a purpose, and that's what that's about.
Wow.
So I brought these out. We talked about the 32 Ford, the water inlet and the motor mount being two separate pieces.
Yeah.
In 33 and up, they were one piece. This is an example of a 33 and 34 motor mount and water inlet. These have had some extensions welded on by somebody in years gone by, but you can see how the water inlet and the motor mount are now one piece.
Yeah.
33, 34. These are examples of 35 and 36.
Okay.
And this actually would be over here, but you can see how much further this steps up.
Yeah.
And that's because the frames for 35 are different than the frames for 33 and 34. So similar design, but different.
Yeah, and the 32 goes forward more, and this goes off to the side.
Yep, this mounts more to the side, as you mentioned. In 32, mounts just right underneath the radiator.
Huh.
This water pump is what they introduced towards the end of what I call the first generation Flatheads. 1937, Ford took the water pumps off of the cylinder head and put them in the front of the block. So this is in my opinion, this is the last year of what I call the first gen Flatheads. So it's 21 studs, still holding the cylinder heads on. Still has the extended bell housing like the 32 and earlier motors do. But Ford moved the water pumps from the cylinder head down to the block.
Okay. Interesting.
I say it's unique to 1937. There'll be some people watching that say, hey, I know of a 38 that had this motor in it, and that's true, I think. I like to make the cutoff at 37 for the first gen and 38 being the second gen, the 24 studs. But there'll be some folks that know that there was some overlap between 37 and 38 models where this engine carried over into 38. But this was the last year for 21 studs holding the cylinder heads on, and the first year for the water pumps to be in the block. So I included it in the first gen because it's 21 stud motor.
Yeah.
But it definitely has some attributes of the second generation with the water pumps being down in the block.
Yeah. So you call 37 slightly a transition year, but still hanging on to Series 1.
Yes.
As we're calling it.
Right. That's right.
Very good.
That's a 37 is another like 1 year only motor, right? It's the only year where there was 21 studs and water pumps in the block. So 32 is kind of a 1 year only, and 37 is as well.
Now the water pump, moving it down, I guess, allowed you to service the heads without messing with the front part of the engine.
It's my understanding that Ford moved them in an effort to increase or improve cooling of the block.
Okay.
Flatheads, anybody that's ever owned one knows they tend to be a little difficult to keep cool. So Ford experienced that early on with the 32, 33, all the way up. And I think in 37, moving the pumps down, a better pump, more efficient pump, and was able to get the water through the block, in my opinion, better than the up on the heads.
Okay. The fact that you have so many, so you seem to have at least one of every kind of version of these engines.
Yeah, well, that's probably true. Maybe there's even half a dozen of each one in here.
Yeah.
But doing that helps me learn, right? I don't need 92 Flatheads, and someday I hope I don't have 92 Flatheads. But when you get into them, there's a lot to learn. There's differences. Every year is slightly different, no matter if it's starting in 32 all the way to 53. There are slight differences with every motor. And for me anyway, the way to learn is to dig in and pull them out and study them, take them apart, and that's one of the ways I learn the history.
Well, but I want to come back to these internals because you showed me a 32 valve.
Yes.
And I don't think I'd seen one before.
Yeah, let's talk about the valve train just a little bit.
Yeah.
So interestingly, in 1932, Ford actually, right out of the bat, the valve and the lifter were the same piece. They weren't two pieces.
Really?
And that didn't last very long, probably for a lot of things that we could think of as why it wouldn't last very long. But during the 32 year, including this motor, Ford went to this design of valve guide, spring, and retainer. One thing I want to point out is that they have this, I call it tulip shape on the end. And Ford used this from 1932 to 1948. This is something a design they used for a long, long time.
Wow.
If you've ever worked on one though, you'll know that this is not your friend. These are very difficult to work with.
So you're saying they are up through 48 they used those?
Yeah, they didn't go to I'd say a more modern design like most of us are used to until the third generation, 49 to 53.
Okay.
But I have a couple of the valve, because of this tulip and the fact that the head of the valve is here, the valve guide is actually two pieces because there wouldn't be any way to put it on the valve if it was one piece.
Right.
So it goes on there like that, and then the spring would slide on, and then this clip would go in, and you'd end up with an assembly that looks like that.
Interesting.
This would drop into the block as a unit, just like that. The early ones didn't have any valve seals on them.
Really?
The later ones did, but the early ones didn't. And then the assembly was held in. Once this was in the block, then there were some tools you used to pull the guide down, which compressed the spring, and then this little clip goes in right here. And that, so that if you could picture
holds it in place.
Yeah, from the underside of the cylinder head deck.
Right, in the valley there.
Yeah. So to get them out, you have to be able to compress the spring enough to pull these back out. This is an example of an early lifter. Some of them were solid, so just a solid piece. Some of them had these sides cut out more, I guess, for weight. I really don't know. But Ford used this design from 32 all the way through the end of the third generation. So all the way up to 1953, they used this solid lifter. And the way the valve was, the valve clearance was adjusted was to grind the end of the valve off to establish the clearance between the the lifter and the valve.
Wow.
Which was about 13 thousandths back in the day. So very difficult to work on.
So you're doing some machining no matter what.
Yeah, so to adjust the valves, if you needed to machine this off, you had to take cylinder heads off, you had to take these clips out, you had to take the valve assembly out, grind it off, and put it back in and check the clearance again. So very difficult.
Yeah.
Very, very difficult.
Wow.
But that's the design that Ford used for well, from 32 till 48. They went to a more modern valve, but they maintained those solid lifters all the way through.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah. I brought this out because Ford did make from 1937 to 1940, so it kind of straddles the first gen, second gen mentality that I have, but it's its own unique motor. They call them V8 60s. They made 60 horsepower, 136 cubic inches, so relatively small. That one's 221 cubic inches. And here's an example of a connecting rod out of a V8 60.
Wow.
And I'll just hold this over in comparison to this one out of I'll say a more, this flathead we always think about.
Right.
And then I'll just put this cylinder head over here just so we can see what the size differences is for
yeah.
So a much smaller engine, but inside they were pretty much the same, just way smaller. The valves are smaller, pistons are smaller, cranks smaller, rods are smaller. But they put them in 37 through 40 passenger cars, and it was more of their economy engine. They were thought that they would get better fuel economy, still smooth like a V8, but smaller. But there were some changes from 37 to 40. We probably won't go into that anytime soon, but an example is 1937 when they came out, the sides of the engine, so the sides of the block were actually stainless steel welded to cast iron.
You're kidding.
They call them tin sides. They weren't really tin, they were stainless steel. They perfected the castings in the later engines, especially the 3940s are cast just like I'll say a traditional flathead is, but those early 37s have a welded side on each side of the block.
I wonder what the purpose of that was.
Well, I think they had a lot of trouble with the castings, so they solved it by making the castings simple, but welding stainless steel to the side.
Huh.
My dad has one, actually, a 10-side engine, and it's actually, the welding's beautiful. And it doesn't rust, the stainless, so it's a pretty interesting motor.
That is really, really interesting.
So anyway, I brought out the head and the connecting rod just to kind of show what the V8 60 was about.
No, it's definitely, you can see the engineering or the design similarity 100%, but much smaller.
Yeah.
And I noticed real quick that they have a cutout here for the piston, whereas these others.
Yeah, so I used a dome piston instead of a flat top, which is what these used.
Okay. So why don't you tell us how the pistons work within this
Oh, yeah.
head?
It's a good question. So as you mentioned, Barry, this cylinder head is dished for a domed piston.
Mm-hmm.
And on flatheads, that's one thing you need to do is match the piston to whatever cylinder head that you're planning to use.
Yeah.
Most of the, the second gen and the third gen use the domed piston design, so all the cylinder heads are also domed. But
Okay.
these early ones, like the 32, 33, and 34, used a flat top piston in the block.
Okay.
So the heads, there is no dish here where the piston
Right.
would be.
So it would just be clearance to get right up to it. And
Yeah, well, you have the gasket is in here, so that
Right.
provides usually 60 thousandths or so
Okay.
of an inch, and then most engines, if they haven't been surfaced, the piston doesn't quite come all the way to the top anyway. So there's plenty of room, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's all about, you can kind of see, all about cylinder head design and improving efficiency and making power and fuel economy as well.
Yeah.
Much more advanced cylinder head design in the later engines.
So this is a 33 or 34.
Right.
Now tell me why you knew that this one was a little bit newer than that one.
Well, I'm gonna compare this one to a motor that's down there just a little ways.
Okay.
But I mentioned that the early motors didn't really have a crankcase ventilation system. You had the breather.
Yep.
Up on the intake manifold, but really no crankcase ventilation system. So
Mm-hmm.
the way that you can identify a 35 block, which was the first year they went to a Ford designed crankcase ventilation system, is to look for this tube that I think you were pointing out. This happens to be a second generation motor,
Okay.
but this tube right here is a telltale sign for the 35 and newer motors.
Okay.
This is a 35 motor, and you can see that tube right there.
Yeah. And
Yep.
okay.
So, and correspondingly down on the oil pan, there's a little vent right there where my finger is.
There, yeah, I see it.
The earlier pans don't have that little vent or the tube through the block.
Huh.
So we talked earlier about the motor mounts and the water inlets being cast into one piece.
Right.
So that's one way to tell it's a 33 or 34 motor.
Uh-huh.
Has the cavity beside, so we know it's not a 32 block.
Yep.
The water petcock is at an angle,
There's the angle.
so that makes it not a 32 motor.
Uh-huh.
It doesn't have the crankcase vent, so it's not a 35 motor. So we know it's a 33 or 34 motor.
Right. This is
Just by looking at the exhaust manifold and the block and the petcock where it's at and whether there's a vent or not, we know that's a 33 or 34 motor.
Okay. And the other thing I'm going to point out is we're seeing how this gear is attached without bolts here.
Yeah, pressed on like we talked about.
Yep. Well, if you're really looking for something specific, a specific gear, you better kind of be paying attention to all this.
Yeah, but once you know it, it's pretty easy to pick those things out, right?
Uh-huh,
Once
yeah.
you know them, you know them.
Yeah.
I'm going to mention, we talked about the 32 having cast iron heads and the 33 and 34 going to aluminum heads.
Mm-hmm.
This is an example of cast iron heads on a 33, 34 where somebody's changed them.
Oh, okay.
So if
So you've already figured out this is a 33 or 34 block.
yeah,
So, but the fact that it has cast iron heads
yeah.
means they're different heads.
Well, it means somebody changed them. They
Right.
would originally come with the aluminum heads like we saw on the bench.
Yeah.
But as I mentioned, a lot of people, either maintenance folks, Ford, changed these from aluminum to cast iron so that they could get them back off
Right.
easier than the aluminum heads. So this is an example of cast iron heads on a 33 or 34, which would have come originally with aluminum heads.
Right. So I imagine, we're talking about 90 years ago.
Yeah.
So someone, anything that you have to service where you have to take the head off, you probably only want to do it one time with
That's
that
right.
aluminum head
That's right.
and say, okay, I'm done with that.
That's right. That's a fact.
So that could have been swapped out 85 years ago.
Who knows? So this block has the water inlets and the motor mounts for a 35, 36.
Mm-hmm.
We know it's at least a 35 because it has the crankcase ventilation built into it.
Right.
And there's another thing to look for. 35 and 36 are very similar. 36 happened to be the first year that Ford went to an insert style main bearing design, like a modern engine.
Okay.
Before that, like the 32, 33, 34, 35 had poured Babbitt for the main bearings. 36 was the first year. Now, the 36s are you really can't tell externally it's a 36 from a 35, but they'll typically be stamped right in here or maybe even in the back with the letters LB. Okay. And I don't know what that stands for. I've heard different, large bearing, but the 36s were supposed to be stamped LB.
Okay.
Now, if you're at swap meet and you see an LB on a block, somebody could easily have stamped an LB in there, just because the 36s are more desirable than 35s because they have modern main bearing design.
Right.
But I do have a 36 block back here that we could look at if you want to. There are a lot of similarities in the later years because they changed the design less, but especially in these early years when they're developing, technology's improving, machining's improving, they're learning more, about what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah.
There are differences in just about every year in the first generation motors.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. They had to. They were learning, so let's put something better together next time if we know how to do it.
That's right.
Okay, so how do I know this is a 36 block? Can you help me out?
Well, Barry, that's a good question. The primary difference is that in 36, Ford went to what I call insert style main bearings.
Yep.
Just about every vehicle made today has insert style main bearings. But for Ford, this was the first year, 1936. And so this one, the bearings are out of it, but you can see the little, I call them tangs there where the bearing would fit. So that's one way to tell.
It wouldn't go there, that's for sure.
So that's one way to tell. The other is to look for the stamping. Yep, that's it.
So there's an LB right there.
Yep, so that's what to look for. It's best to go a little bit further to see if it really has the insert bearings in it. But that's the first sign that it's a 36. 21 studs with the LB marked in it.
Okay.
And the crankcase ventilation system.
Yeah.
Those are the things to look for 36. This is for the old time, for the people that want to run nostalgia racing, where a 21 stud motor is desirable for the class that they're running in. The 36 is the one people go after because it still has the water pumps up on the heads, still 21 studs, but it has the modern bearing system in it, which makes it more desirable for high performance applications.
As you say it that way, that makes sense, right? Yeah. It's the 21 stud and the water pump. That's for the nostalgia look.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, the bearing is for the functionality.
Yeah, and reliability and cost. It's a lot cheaper to replace bearings in this block than the 35 block right behind us.
Yep. It's also not even apparently all that easy to find people that do Babbitt bearings.
Oh, they're out there, but and there's some good folks doing it, and it's just expensive. And like as you said, it's probably not something you'll find in your hometown. Probably have to ship it, and that just adds up to the cost as well. Still good motor when you get it back, but the 36 is more desirable from that aspect.
Yep. Okay.
This hole right here, Barry, the Ford put that on the first and second generation flatheads, and they were called they were used to attach anti-chatter rods, is what Ford called them.
Okay.
They ran from the engine back to the frame.
Huh.
And there's probably, as we talked earlier, people that'll have different opinions about what the anti-chatter rods do or what they were intended to do or whether they do anything or not. But I guess the point that I was wanting to make today is on the very early 32 blocks, there would be just a machine flat pad right here and this bracket for this anti-chatter rod bolted on. Since this one is cast in as part of the block, this is not an early 32 block. It's probably mid-year or so 32 block, so because it has the cast in anti-chatter bracket.
Yeah, another little piece of trivia to keep track of.
Yes, yes.
That is pretty crazy.
Yep.
How do you service the clutch on this thing?
Oh, that's another great question, Barry. And of course, we have it in just a stand here today. But
yeah,
the transmission would bolt on right here, and just there really weren't any differences in how this transmission bolted on over the Flathead years. We'll talk maybe some other time about a different bell housing design, but the bolt pattern really remained the same pretty much the entire time.
Mm-hmm.
But the clutch will physically come out if we were to unbolt it.
Okay, you can get it out.
But the flywheel won't.
Ah.
It has a ring gear on it where the starter attaches, and it just won't physically fit through that hole.
Ah.
So in order to get the flywheel off, you have to take the oil pan off and then unbolt the flywheel, and then it'll drop down from the top down.
Wow.
So this was kind of a real pain in the early years to have to take the oil pan off to get to the flywheel.
So that oil pan, it goes all the way back to the end of the bell housing.
Yep, this
all
is
the way through the
way
front of the engine.
All the way through. Yep.
That is a massive oil pan.
Yep.
Wow. Okay, another thing. Thank you so much, Steve, for
thank you, Barry,
giving us a good run through the Series 1, as we're calling it.
Yeah.
And I've already learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to the next one, too.
Yeah, we should have some more fun, and I have plenty of parts to drag out and look at, so you're welcome back
awesome.
anytime.
All right, very good. Take care.
See ya.
Thanks for joining us once again for another episode of Barry T's Garage. Thank you for your likes, your comments. Your comments are a lot of fun, so please feel free to add what you see or what you know more about these first series of Flathead Ford V8s. And join us for another one coming up next. I just want to mention that all the information and more that is covered as far as the details of these Flathead Ford V8s are in that book that Joe Aben has created. It's available on Steve's website. So I'll try to put a link in the description. But again, Steve has those books. He had them reprinted and they're available. It's a great encyclopedia of information, especially when you want to cross-reference what fits and what goes with what. I guess that's the same thing. That's the place to get it. So have a look at that.